Something is very wrong inside Princess Beatrice's marriage, and the story that's emerging is one that nobody in the royal establishment wants you to hear. Because if you follow the thread all the way back to where this started, you don't end up at Beatrice and Edoardo. You end up at Andrew and Fergie. You end up at two people who have spent decades creating chaos, scandal, and embarrassment, and whose daughter is now paying the price for every single one of their mistakes. So stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through is going to completely change the way you see this situation. Let's start at the very beginning, because to understand what's happening to Beatrice right now, you have to understand the environment she grew up in. Beatrice was born into what looked like a fairy tale. Her father was a prince, her mother was glamorous and vivacious, and for a brief moment in the late 1980s, Andrew and Fergie were one of the most exciting couples in the royal family. But that fairy tale collapsed almost before Beatrice was old, enough to remember it. By the time she was 4 years old, her parents were separated. By the time she was 6, they were divorced. And the divorce wasn't quiet, it wasn't dignified, and it certainly wasn't private. It was one of the most spectacular and humiliating royal separations in modern history, played out on front pages around the world while a little girl watched her family fall apart in real time. Now think about what that does to a child. Think about growing up knowing that your parents' relationship is tabloid fodder, that strangers have opinions about your mother's toes, that your father's name is associated with scandal after scandal after scandal. Beatrice never got a normal childhood. In that sense, she grew up in the wreckage of a very public collapse, and she had to build her identity and her sense of self in the middle of all of that. And here's what's crucial. Andrew and Fergie didn't just damage each other when their marriage fell apart. They set in motion a chain of events that would follow their daughters for the rest of their lives. Because here's the thing about growing up with parents like Andrew and Fergie. You don't just inherit their title and their privilege. You inherit their reputation. You inherit the baggage. You inherit the way the press looks at you, the way the public perceives you, and the way the rest of the royal family treats you. Beatrice has spent her entire adult life trying to carve out something stable and respectable for herself against the backdrop of two parents who made that almost impossible. And just when it looked like she might have finally found her footing, just when it looked like her marriage to Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi was giving her the stability she'd always craved, the cracks are starting to show. And the question everyone is asking is why? Why now? Why them? They seemed so solid. Well, let me tell you what's really going on, because the answer takes us straight back to Andrew and Fergie, and it is far more complicated and far more troubling than anything that's been reported so far. Let's talk about Edoardo for a moment, because understanding him is key to understanding this whole situation. Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi is a property developer. He's charming, he's well-connected, and on the surface, he looks like the perfect match for Beatrice. He has his own money, his own career, his own identity. He's not someone who needed to marry a princess to make something of himself, or at least that's how it appeared. But sources close to the situation are now painting a very different picture. And what they're describing is something that should make every single one of you watching this deeply uncomfortable. The suggestion, and it's one that's gaining traction in circles close to the family, is that Edoardo's relationship with Beatrice was always about more than just Beatrice. That from very early on, the connection to the royal family, specifically to Andrew and the whole orbit around him, was something that served Edoardo's interests in ways that went beyond love and partnership. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying Edoardo doesn't have genuine feelings for Beatrice. That's not the point. The point is that when you marry into a family like this one, especially this particular branch of the royal family, the lines between personal and professional, between love and opportunity, can get very blurred very quickly. And what people close to Beatrice are now whispering is that those lines have become dangerously blurred. Think about what Andrew brings to the table even now, even after everything. Even in disgrace, even after stepping back from royal duties, even after the Jeffrey Epstein scandal rewrote the narrative of his entire life, Andrew still has connections. He still has access to certain circles, certain networks, certain rooms that most people will never get anywhere near. And a property developer with ambition and charm and a very convenient marriage to Andrew's daughter is someone who could potentially benefit enormously from those connections. That's the uncomfortable reality that people are starting to talk about. That Beatrice's value in this marriage was never just about who she is as a person, but about who her father is and what doors that opens. And if you think that sounds harsh, imagine how it feels to be Beatrice. Imagine being a woman who has spent her whole life trying to be seen as more than just her parents' daughter, trying to be valued for herself, trying to build something real, and then finding yourself wondering whether the person you chose, the person you built your life around, sees you the same way the rest of the world always has. Not as Beatrice, as Andrew's daughter, as the key to a door that was otherwise locked. That kind of realization doesn't just damage a marriage, it devastates a person. But we can't talk about any of this without going deeper into the Andrew problem. Because Andrew is not just a background figure in this story. Andrew is central to it. And the way he has handled, or rather catastrophically mishandled, everything that has happened to him over the last several years has created a situation that is genuinely toxic for everyone around him, including his, daughter. The Epstein scandal broke open something that couldn't be put back together. Andrew's disastrous Newsnight interview, which was meant to clear his name, and instead became one of the most cringe-inducing television moments in British history, didn't just end his royal career. It cast a shadow over his entire family. And while Eugenie has largely managed to distance herself from the fallout, Beatrice has remained closer to her father, more loyal, more present, and that loyalty has cost her. Because every time Andrew's name appears in a headline, which is often Beatrice's name is not far behind. Every time someone Googles the Duke of York, the search results pull up his daughters. She cannot escape him, and the more toxic his reputation becomes, the more that toxicity splashes onto her life, her marriage, her public image, and then there's the money situation, which is something people don't talk about enough, because Andrew and Fergie's financial chaos is legendary. Fergie's debts, her various business ventures that didn't quite work out, the freelance nature of her income, the constant need to monetize her royal-adjacent status, all of that has created a family dynamic where money is always a source of stress and tension. Andrew lost his taxpayer-funded security when he stepped back from royal duties, and there have been ongoing questions about how he and Fergie are maintaining their lifestyle at Royal Lodge. Sources have suggested that the financial pressure within that household is significant, and that pressure doesn't stay neatly contained within the walls of Royal Lodge. It ripples outward. It affects the people connected to Andrew and Fergie. It creates obligations, expectations, and dynamics that nobody outside the family fully understands. Now add Edoardo into this mix. A property developer, someone whose business depends on relationships, on networking, on access to the right people and the right opportunities. And suddenly the family dynamic around Beatrice becomes a lot more complicated. Because what happens when the man you married starts getting pulled into the financial and social orbit of your deeply complicated parents? What happens when the boundaries between his business interests and your family's needs start to dissolve? What happens when you realize that the life you thought you were building together is actually more entangled with Andrew and Fergie than you ever intended it to be? This is what sources are pointing to when they talk about the crumbling of Beatrice's marriage. Not a single dramatic moment, not one big betrayal, but a slow accumulation of entanglements, pressures, and realizations that have eroded something. That should have been solid. And let's not forget Fergie's role in all of this, because Sarah Ferguson is never just a passive presence in any situation. Fergie has always had an extraordinary ability to insert herself into the center of whatever is happening around her, and her relationship with both her daughters is intense, complicated, and very enmeshed. She has been open about the fact that she and Andrew have remained extremely close despite their divorce, that they live together at Royal Lodge, that they are in many ways still a unit even if they're no longer married, and that closeness, that refusal to maintain appropriate boundaries, creates a very particular kind of pressure on Beatrice's marriage. Because what does it mean for Beatrice to be truly independent, to have her own life, her own marriage, her own identity, when her parents are essentially still living as a couple in the house where she grew up? What does it mean for Edoardo to be the man in Beatrice's life when Andrew is always right there, always present, always a gravitational force that pulls everything back into his orbit? Healthy marriages require space. They require two people to be able to put each other first, to build their own world, to make their own decisions. And it is very difficult to do any of that when your parents, with all their drama and chaos and need, are constantly pulling at the edges of everything you're trying to build. There's also the question of identity, and this is something I think gets overlooked in conversations about Beatrice. She is a woman who has never quite been allowed to be just herself. She's always been Andrew's daughter, or Fergie's daughter, or the princess in the funny hat, or the one who's not Eugenie. She has spent years trying to find her footing, and when she married Edoardo and had their daughter Sienna, it genuinely looked like she had found it. She had a family. She had a role. She had something that was hers. And the idea that even that is now under threat, that even the one thing she built for herself is being destabilized by the same forces that have destabilized everything else in her life, is genuinely heartbreaking. But here's what I think is the most important thing to understand about this whole situation, and it's something that gets lost when we talk about royal marriages in terms of gossip and scandal and who said what to whom. What's happening to Beatrice is not just a personal story. It's a story about what happens when children are raised in environments of chaos and instability, when the adults around them never really do the work of taking responsibility for the damage they cause when privilege and dysfunction exist side by side in a way that makes it almost impossible to grow up into a fully whole and healthy person. Andrew never truly faced consequences in the way that someone in his position arguably should have. He stepped back from royal duties, yes. He lost his military titles, yes. But he is still living at Royal Lodge. He is still surrounded by the trappings of his former life. He has never, as far as anyone can tell, done the deep internal work of reckoning with how his choices and his behavior have affected the people around him, including his daughters. Fergie has been more self-aware in some ways, more willing to acknowledge her mistakes publicly, but she too has a pattern of creating chaos and then leaning on the people around her to help manage the fallout. And Beatrice has always been one of those people. She has always been the responsible one, the one who tries to hold things together, the one who stays loyal even when loyalty costs her. And maybe, just maybe, she is finally reaching the point where the cost is too high. Maybe she is finally starting to ask herself some very difficult questions about what she has allowed into her life and why, and what it would mean to choose herself for once. Because at the end of the day, whatever is happening between Beatrice and Edoardo, whatever the truth is about his motivations and her doubts, and the role Andrew and Fergie have played in all of it, the person at the center of this story is a woman who deserves better than the hand she has been dealt. She deserves parents who put her needs first. She deserves a partner who loves her for who she is, not for the doors her surname can open. She deserves to live a life that is not constantly overshadowed by other people's scandals and mistakes, and needs. Whether she is going to find a way to build that life, whether this marriage can survive the pressures bearing down on it, whether Andrew and Fergie will ever truly reckon with the damage they have caused, these are questions that don't have easy answers. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The crumbling of Beatrice's marriage is not happening in a vacuum. It is the latest chapter in a much longer story, a story that started long before Beatrice ever met Edoardo, in a house where two people who should have known better chose their own drama over their daughter's well-being, again and again and again. And now their daughter is living with the consequences, as she always has, as she perhaps always feared she would. The question is whether this time, finally, something is going to change.